I guess the first question I would have to maybe throw out to all three of you is, could you take a minute each and describe perhaps the difference between the proposals, and perhaps why is one better? How would you distinguish, and what is the difference?
Well, first, revenues are going to have to go up. It's primarily a spending problem. Math doesn't come close to working. And anybody who tells you otherwise, anywhere, not very good at math. Okay, I'm a CPA among other things. So that's the first thing, all right? Second thing is balanced budget, we've already said won't work. 49 of 50 states have it. There are a number of states that would go bankrupt today if they could. They're not eligible for bankruptcy under current federal law because of how they calculate a balanced budget, all right? Thirdly, you have to think about political feasibility. In order to get something either the old-fashioned way, two-thirds of the House, two-thirds of the Senate, three-quarters of the states, or the way we're advocating, which is two-thirds of the states propose a convention and then three-quarters of states have to ratify, it's got to be politically feasible from a bipartisan standpoint. The last comment I would make is that, and I think the debt to GDP is the one that is by far the most politically feasible. It is accepted by economists. It is a measure that accomplishes what needs to be accomplished, but yet it gives Congress some power as to determine what the mix ought to be between mandatory spending reductions over time, discretionary spending priorities and reductions over time, and revenue over time with an enforcement mechanism. Because if you don't have that, you don't have much.
So Barry, would you speak to that? What's the difference, and particularly this enforcement mechanism portion? You go ahead and speak to that.
Okay. First of all, revenue. I don't think there's anything that requires that revenue or spending increases relative to GDP. And indeed, that's what in Switzerland, it's been relative. Essentially, what the Swiss debt break there requires is that the government grow no more rapidly than income. So why should government grow more rapidly, either in terms of revenue or spending? I would disagree with that. He says that you state legislators have failed. That's not true. There are a few zombie states like Illinois who haven't balanced their budget and haven't constrained debt for half a century. They're zombies. They are bankrupt. They are. Well, I'm saying there are a few exceptions, that there are a few zombies out there, and of course the federal government bails them out. But most state legislators are reasonably successful in balancing their budget year in and year out. There's some years where they fail, some years where they don't fail. So states are the success story here. And my state, Colorado, is a success story, not just in balancing the budget. We have the Tabor Amendment that, in fact, imposes the kind of constraints that I am proposing. It constrains the growth of government to inflation and population growth. It limits debt. It requires voter approval for any increase in taxes and debt. And by the way, I'll tell you the reason for the success of the Swiss debt break. Citizens vote on everything at every level of government. They rely on the referendum, the initiative, and they have put fiscal measures on the ballot in Switzerland hundreds and hundreds of times. Rely on your citizens. Have trust in your citizens. They are fiscally frugal. In Colorado, this goes back over the Republican and Democratic. We went from a red state to a blue state, but people have been proposing increases in taxes on the budget, on the ballot in Colorado for the last 3 decades. Hundreds of measures. At the state level, the only tax increases that have been passed are sin taxes. Citizens don't like tax increases, believe it or not. And if you rely on them, they won't raise taxes. They won't raise your tax burden. Flexibility. Well, I think that what the Swiss have decided, they have this very straightforward constitutional amendment that's very straightforward. Balance the budget over the business cycle so you can have, if you have deficits, you've got to balance that with surpluses. That's pretty straightforward and it's pretty flexible. And it, of course, provides for emergencies. So there's a lot of flexibility built into those fiscal rules. And I think that the fundamental issue for me is, will people understand this? If you go to the citizens of your state and say, we think that under Article 5, we should enact an amendment to the Constitution to constrain debt, to constrain the growth of government, and you explain that to them, you're going to have to explain this in simple, straightforward terms. Essentially, we got to balance the budget. We got to bring expenditures into line with revenue, and we have to limit the amount of debt. And this means constraining the growth of government spending. That's an easy sell. That's what we sold with Tabor. I helped design Tabor. I helped pass it. And we have a success story in the States, not failure. So if you look at our experience, this is the kind of amendment that will make it and will work.
So let's come to David then. David, your explanation of.
Can I just say real quick? Okay. Simple explanation, credit card limit. Every American knows what a credit card limit is, all right? And reduce debt burdens. They understand what that is, all right? I can tell you, I've served Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. I have contacts on both sides of the political aisle. I have a very good sense of what's politically feasible and what's not politically feasible. And we can all have great ideas. And I do think it's a good idea, all right? And I do support the concepts. And Tabor, I think, is great. I think it's great, okay? I wish Congress was as responsible as most state legislatures. They're not. And I also agree that if you can get this to the people, you'll get a lot better result. You'll get a lot better result. I agree with that.
We agree more than we disagree,
So-
you can tell.
David Biddulph, how would you describe the differences in what you're proposing?
Well, my approach is very simplistic, and the job for you people that have become delegates to the convention for proposing a fiscal responsibility amendment will have to do the math. This is a math problem. And you know, Dave could be right. You may have to have some revenue increases. We won't know that until we actually start putting together the models. And Dr. Paulson and Meriwether, is he here? Are putting together, and there are other people that have models. We need to run the models to educate yourself on what needs to be done to ensure the long-term prosperity of this country. And so it could well be that we have to have a belt and suspenders, as Walker likes to talk about. So,
So I'd like to throw to each of you, how do any of your proposals deal with the QE, the printing? I mean, if you're setting limits, does the Federal Reserve just not find a way to work around that? And
Well,
now we're doing reverse repos and QEs and all of these different things. Are there not ways around those sorts of things in what you're proposing?
well, the truth is, federal fiscal policy is irresponsible and unsustainable. And the truth is that the current Fed monetary policy is unsustainable as well. And I did an op-ed, and in fact, it's enabling irresponsible fiscal policy by artificially keeping interest rates low, by buying a vast majority of the new debt. So we don't really have market rates right now, okay? And what I've proposed with regard to the Fed is to eliminate the requirement for them to focus on short-term unemployment. That they should focus on how do we grow the economy over time, which provides more opportunity? How do we maintain stable prices over time? But when you get them to have to focus on short-term unemployment, that politicizes them. And right now we're in a situation where the economy is growing. We have a record number of job openings, but we still have higher unemployment. And so that's giving them an excuse to do a lot of things that are short-term gain, increased risk of long-term pain, and that needs to change. We need to get them focused on what they were originally set up for, and depoliticize them because they've been politicized right now. And I don't think they're as independent as they need to be.
So Barry, to that point, then, are we not just pushing on a balloon? If you're dealing with the fiscal policy and the budgetary policies, the monetary policy, not just another blowout you push on one side of the balloon, it comes out somewhere else. How do you deal with that in the context of this kind of amendment?
Well, I agree with David. And the answer the way I would put it is, there was a time in which we had monetary responsibility as well as fiscal responsibility. Go back to the 1990s, Paul Volcker achieved an incredible achievement.
Yeah.
He constrained the growth of money, the money supply, and he brought inflation down from, remember inflation in 1980? Double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates. By the end of the 1990s, Volcker had the inflation rate down below 5%, as I recall, and interest rates weren't much higher. We balanced the budget, by the way, for a few years in the late 1990s. It's called the Great Moderation in the economics literature. We had legislators, we had people in the Fed who pursued responsible monetary policies, responsible fiscal policies. Unfortunately, that Great Moderation is gone. We've given up on fiscal rules. We've given up on monetary rules. The Fed is essentially an arm of the Treasury. The Fed is pumping money into the system because that's what the Treasury wants. They want low interest rates on bonds so they can borrow more and spend more and borrow more and spend more. And unfortunately, we don't have a Paul Volcker out there, and we don't have a Phil Gramm out there anymore. And we cannot rely on the discretion of legislators. We can't rely on the discretion of the Fed. And I would take your argument one step further. Not only do we have to have fiscal rules, we have to have monetary rules. And there's a really good literature in economics on how you can constrain monetary policy by imposing rules on the money supply, rules on monetary policy. You should grow it. Milton Friedman had it right a half a century ago. You should grow the money supply somewhat more rapidly than the growth of income. And that will keep your inflation rate at the 4%, 5% level. Now that is what they achieved. We can get there, but not by discretion, not relying on the decision of legislators or the Fed officials. We need rules, rules-based fiscal policy, rules-based monetary policy, just like you have rules-based fiscal policy at the state level.
Thank you, David. Bidoff?
To answer that question, we may have two spending growth limits. And one of them would be if inflation, it gets over a certain percent, it would affect the growth, spending growth. In other words, if the Federal Reserve was pumping in money and we got into inflation, then spending would potentially actually start stopping and maybe even start cutting. In other words, the household income under inflation, they're losing spending power, they're losing standard of living. We don't think that the government should be able to get away with that, that we would penalize the government from growing if they tried to do it through monetary policy, so that it would be in essence a fiscal rule that was built into the MAP amendment. Secondly, that was essentially a MAP amendment that was put into the Constitution by a vote of the people in Colorado. And in the 20 years afterwards, this is where I always come back to prosperity. In the 20 years after, the income to what is it? The per capita GDP of Colorado increased almost 100% more over the next 20 years than for the country as a whole. The GDP per capita grew almost 100% faster than the GDP per capita for the country.
All right, I have one last question here. What will moving toward this type of fiscal restraint not simply push out fees in times when they limit the budgetary actions of a government, then they simply come back and add fees somewhere else? Is that not something you'd be concerned about? Let's go ahead and start with you this time.
Under my proposal, if they added a fee, it's going to go to pay off the debt because they can't spend anywhere. They can't come up with another program and, you know, tax this group or that group because they cannot spend more money than the spending growth limit. So go ahead and pass the fee. It's going to pay off the debt.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, I think you're probably addressing our problem in Colorado, and that is that because Tabor was effective in constraining spending and certain types of spending and certain types of revenue, because it's both a revenue and a spending limit. Of course, our legislators found many ways to call taxes fees. They have an excise tax on hospitals. They call it a fee. And they have, there's no question, they have been successful in circumventing this to some extent. But as David said, ultimately, the constraint on the spending side does limit what they can do. And we're trying to address the fee issue by amending the Tabor to apply to fees as well as taxes.